Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University. I would like to welcome all of you. This is a two-day conference, and this is the second day of the conference on Iran and Iranian Jewry. Yesterday we dealt mostly with processes that had to do with Iran before the revolution and after the revolution. Today we are taking the subject to another angle, which is the history and heritage of the Iranian Jews. And I would like to again welcome all of you and wish all of us a very successful and interesting day. And Professor Shaul Shaked, it is all yours now. Okay,
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased and honored to have the opportunity to open this second day of the conference, which, at least in the morning, is dedicated to the subjects that are close to my heart, the pre-Islamic period and their connection, and Iran's connection with Judaism and with Jewish sources in this period. And the first speaker this morning is going to be my friend, Professor Zeev Rubin of this university, who is going to speak about Jewish sources on the Sasanian tax system.
Well, a few words of apology and explanation pending the time when the handout is being distributed. It is a rule of thumb that every presentation in such a conference has got to open with a kind of an apology. I prepared a written version of this paper. I forgot it at home. I think it was a kind of Freudian lapse because it is 20 pages. And all I've got is only, I've been told, 30 minutes, part of which I am already wasting now. Second, the original title is Jewish Sources on the Sasanian Tax System. I found it advisable to modify this because, it would have gotten out of hand completely. And what I am doing is concentrating on the evidence in the Babylonian Talmud for the land tax only, and naturally before the reforms of Khusro Anushirwan, because as it is well known to all and sundry, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, antedates the reforms of Khusro Anushirwan. Now, as for the handout itself, there is a select bibliography, perhaps too brutally select. There are a few things which I haven't managed to incorporate, such as rather recent editions of two Arabic texts, the Nihayat al-Irab fi Akhbar Al-Furs wal-Arab. There is a recent edition on the basis of two microfilms made of the London manuscript. There are two other manuscripts which have not been brought into consideration. I haven't incorporated it. The failure is all mine. In the original sort of discussion that I published a couple of years ago of the reforms of Khusro Anushirwan, I had to rely on, of course, the manuscript. I used mainly the Cambridge manuscript, which was supplied to me by the courtesy of our chairman, a photocopy of it. And of course, the discussions of it by Griniaski which are 4, 5, and 6 on your handout. The other text is the Tajarib al-Ummam by Miss Kawai, a section of which is a sort of putative autobiography of Khusro Anushirwan, the so-called Sirat Anushirwan, which is one of the most important sources for these reforms. The third important source being, of course, in my view, the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. This is insofar as the reforms are concerned. I am going to open this short presentation with what we can learn about the reforms from the introductions to the reforms themselves in our main sources, mainly in the Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk of Al-Tabari and from the Nihayat al-Irab. Well, the system, insofar as land tax is concerned, consisted in crop sharing, which means part of the crop of the land, muqassamat. The reform consisted itself in introducing a kind of fixed rate, emisaha, whose nature is subject to dispute, into which I am not going to enter at the present moment. Muqassamat, as they are presented in the sources, meant that the king took sometimes as much as half of the crop, sometimes only a third, and sometimes only a quarter, apparently according to the fertility of the land concerned. It was a very problematic sort of taxation system, and apart from the land tax, and here a question of chronology enters into the discussion, which is called in the extant sources for the reform itself, haraj. There was also a poll tax, which is called, referred to in its Arabic name, jizya. The problem, the very first problem, already at the outset of the discussion, is that in the Talmud there seems to be a discrepancy between this terminology and the terminology with which the Jews in Babylonia, Jewish Mesopotamia, were familiar. The term for land tax was taska, and sometimes mnata de malka or mnat hamelech, whereas it is the poll tax which is referred to as karga, which should be perhaps the equivalent of haraj. This in itself causes some problems. Quite a few scholars who discussed Sasanian taxation, trying to adduce the Talmudic evidence as well as other types of evidence, simply ignored the fact that the Talmud came to its conclusion before the rise of Khusro Anushirwan to power, which was 531. Such a discussion, I am drawing your attention to number 12 on your handout, Nina Vasilievna Pigulievskaya, I won't read the Russian title aloud. Its translation is on the tax reform of Khusro Anushirwan. She deals with the Talmudic evidence as relevant, more or less, to the reforms themselves. This is an error not committed by another Soviet scholar who dealt with those reforms from the orthodox party line, Marxist sort of party line, and this is Soloducho in 3 items, 14, 15, and 16 on your handout. This is just to show you what the kind of errors that may creep in is. Now, the discrepancy in terminology already maps a kind of problem, and there is quite a considerable amount of other problems. To start with, in the Talmudic passages that I cite on pages 2 to 4 on the handout, there are a few places that might appear as if the Taska land tax was not at all a tax based on crop shares, i.e. the mukasamat, but rather a sort of fixed rate. And the question arises whether this land tax, the Taska, was or was not identical with the Mnata de Malka, whose very rendering into an intelligible language may suggest that it was a kind of crop sharing tax, the king's portion. The question is what one understands under the title portion. And so I will launch immediately into the very first passage, and already at its beginning I realize what preparing such a passage for discussion under pressure entails. There is a grave error of translation. The translation says, my own translation, I didn't want to get involved in any other translation because every translation is interpretation, especially the translation of passages from the Talmud, whose language is highly condensed and therefore open to lots of ambiguities and misinterpretations, as the number of square brackets that I was forced to put into the text very clearly indicates. Try to read any text without them, and it will make very little sense indeed. Now, the error of translation, these 3 matters Shmuel told to me, no. I have these 3 matters of Shmuel, I have been told that ought to be the translation. I'm proclaiming this in order to save my soul from the burning fire of hell. Now, what is the importance of this passage? Its importance is clearly that it shows the terminology, it reveals the terminology, and it helps us to define its meaning. The Taska unlike the karga, is a land tax, whereas the karga is imposed on the heads of men. It is a poll tax. Karga akarkaf de gavrei manach. Now, let me try to indicate some kind of a possible solution, first of all, to the question of terminology. Is there any Sasanian terminology, Middle Persian Sasanian terminology, that may be pointed out in this connection? Yes, there is. There is the word harg, which appears in the sense of tax in the Maddayani Hazarda Destan, which is a kind of Sasanian digest. Very, very difficult from the context there to describe its exact nature. It appears in connection with land. Land which serves as pledge for the payment of a debt. The use of that land in order to pay the har udbar, the tax and the other sort of impositions, whatever they are. Not clear whether it may be used for the poll tax as well as for the land tax. The context, which is very, very hard to understand, still harder to translate in any intelligible form, much harder than to translate the Talmud itself. We must leave that hanging in the balance, have evidence inconclusive. Is there any clear terminology for the poll tax? Now there is gazidat. I know at least of one text where this word occurs in the meaning of poll tax, and this is in the Abar Madan Shah Vaharam Ivarzavand, which is on the coming of the miraculous King Vaharam. This text refers to the situation already after the Islamic conquest and to the imposition of the poll tax on the Zoroastrians. So, it cannot be used as evidence for any terminology that antedated the Islamic conquest, let alone for the period that antedated all them, ma barash shelahem, we would have said in modern Hebrew slang, and not acting according to the strict rules how they ought to be acting. Now, on the basis of this, it might be concluded that we are here concerned with a crop sharing sort of tax. And indeed, this is what it really is in practice. One is reminded of stories in Ta'allibi and in Ibn Rusta and in Bal'ami about Kavad, King Kavad straying away on a hunt and sort of coming to the vicinity of an orchard where a woman forbade her child to pluck an apple from a tree because the king's tax collectors hadn't yet arrived. This is part of the same primitive system that applied before the reforms of Khusro Anushirwan. The question is this any different from the Taska? What I am saying is that the very use of the Taska as a means of establishing right of ownership implies a very public manner of the payment of this particular tax. And therefore, when this tax is properly paid, I do not think that there is any difference between this and Demnata de Malka. They are simply two Jewish names for the same tax, which is the pre-Khusro Anushirwan reforms Haraj. And I think the Talmudic evidence, if we pay attention to the realities of everyday life, can very, very well be harmonized with the evidence of the sources, the Islamic sources for the reform itself.
Thank you. I should like to thank Professor Rubin for this very interesting presentation. And as you pointed out, the texts are extremely difficult to interpret, and there are several different approaches to interpreting them. The floor is open to any questions, remarks that you would like to make, please.
Well, this is really fascinating because it tells us about what the Islamic conquest inherited in the way of a tax system in place. I wanted to ask whether we know anything about the ownership, I mean the legal status of the land on which this tax was imposed. Was this state land that was in use, or was it privately owned? And did the peasant himself pay the tax, or did the owner of the land pay the tax?
How long can I be?
2 hours.
This is sort of a rather sort of. This is a question fraught with difficulties. Let us start with the concept of Sasanian feudalism, which was so dear to the heart of scholars like Georg Widengren and Franz Altheim and his Ruth Stiel. Not quite easy to determine exactly what it was. According to Widengren, it was something quite similar to the classical feudalism as it is described by Marc Bloch and François Gansoff in Europe. Under this system, theoretically, all land in the country, depending on what this country was, ought to have belonged to the king. And the Taska may have had the function, besides sort of pouring revenues into the king's coffers, of establishing this theoretical right of ownership. Franz Altheim and Ruth Stiel envisage quite a different kind of feudalism, which is much more similar to the German sort of medieval Lehenswesen, with its huge stem duchies, which have very little to do with the authority of the central government, and very vaguely acknowledge this sort of suzerainty of the king. This, of course, brings into mind straight away the great sort of nobles, whether they ought to be called Shahar Daran or Vuzurgan is a totally different question into which I won't go at the present moment. But the point is that there were, according to the established Sasanian historiographic tradition, at least 6 families besides the family of the king himself, who owned huge tracts of land, virtually independent sort of territories, and of course one may very clearly sort of visualize them imposing their own taxes. In fact, there is one passage in Dinawari which relates to a period much later than the reforms of Khusro Anushir I, which would imply the complete and total failure of these reforms, in which he says that the taxes imposed by the great nobles were much easier a burden to bear than the taxes imposed by such king as Khusro II Parvez. Now, we have other sources that refer to the Ahl al-Haraj, the one who pay the land tax, and they are invariably the farmers, the small farmers, the laborers, and so on and so forth. The question of whether the Canaan were part of them or not is another question which is not easy to answer. You are referring to the tax system inherited by the Muslims from the Sasanians. The question is exactly what was inherited. There is, of course, the evidence of this interesting Syriac source, Thomas of Maga, who shows that the Canaan, as victims of exorbitant taxation, not less than the others. So it is very difficult to answer this question unequivocally. And of course, there will have been, even concerning the Vuzurgan or Shahar Daran, a fundamental difference between what had been before the reforms of Khusro Anushir I and what was afterwards. The reforms of Khusro Anushir I, of Kavad I and Khusro Anushir I, were made possible thanks to the consequences of the Mazdakite rebellion, revolt, which was catastrophic to the great families, noble families of the Sasanian Empire. And it was carried out at their expense. But one of the main consequences of my sort of investigations is that it didn't hold out for very long, and those families very, very quickly reasserted themselves.
Okay, I think time is running out, and I should like to thank you once again, and to call upon our next speaker, Shai Secunda, both from the Hebrew University and from Yeshiva University, who is also going to speak about a Talmudic subject, and the title is Irano-Talmudica, Talmudo-Iranica, on the joint future of Talmudic and Middle Iranian studies.
I'll only apologize if I go over the time limit. I hope not to, but there's a lot to talk about. Since its inception, the academic study of the Palestinian Talmud has been accompanied by the comparative study of Talmudic literature against the background of Greco-Roman culture in all its aspects: language, literature, law, and religion. Thus, despite the difficulties inherent within Yerushalmi studies, our understanding of that work has been broadened and deepened by advances in our knowledge of the history, economy, geography, and culture of Roman Palestine. In contrast, at least for more than half a century, the academic study of the Babylonian Talmud has proceeded with little, if any, examination of its Sasanian context, except perhaps for political history. A few important linguists and historians have used Iranian history, languages, and religions in their research of the Bavli. However, Talmudists have seldom expressed interest in Iranica. The posthumous plea of E.S. Rosenthal, directed specifically at Talmudists, to incorporate Iranian studies in their work has largely been ignored. Fortunately, over the past 4 years, Yaakov Elman has campaigned vigorously for the inclusion of Iranian studies in Talmudic research, and Jeffrey Herman, a recently minted Hebrew University PhD, who lectures in Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, has begun publishing groundbreaking interdisciplinary research of Babylonian Jewry and its Sasanian context. As Elman has emphasized in his studies, Jews and Persians lived closely together in Mesopotamia for over 12 centuries, which for most of that time was under Iranian rule. At the beginning of the Amoraic period, some 750 years had elapsed since Cyrus's conquest of Babylon. The Talmud itself observes that at least during Sasanian times, Jews felt especially comfortable in their Babylonian exile. Furthermore, the cosmopolitan nature of the Sasanian capital Ctesiphon and its environs indicates that during the first half of the Sasanian era, Babylonian Jews in Mechoza received a profound lesson in multiculturalism. The name given to this period in Jewish history is the Talmudic era, a term that has rightly been criticized by historians who object to the complete subservience of Jewish, and not only rabbinic, historiography to the free-wielding, ahistorical, and most problematically, exclusive Babylonian Talmud. Nevertheless, none would deny the vitality of this work for subsequent Jewish history. In addition, it seems reasonable to assume that the Babylonian Jewish community which produced the rabbinic authors and editors of the Talmud should be at least partly understood through its folios. Regardless, what is significant is that the massive project of producing, compiling, and editing the defining document of this epoch occurred in the culturally and religiously fertile environment of Sasanian Mesopotamia. There, Zoroastrians, who were well represented in Babylonia and maintained, along with the Catholicos and Reish Galuta, an official clerical presence in the vicinity of the winter capital, Seleucia Ctesiphon, were engaged in the daunting task of creating an alphabet, writing down the Vesta, and also producing, compiling, and editing Zendic works of elucidation and law. Consequently, not only should Talmudists attempt to understand the Bavli in its general Iranian context in ways similar to the successful contextualization of the Yerushalmi and Greco-Roman Palestine, they also need to look at Babylonian rabbinic and Sasanian Zoroastrian literature in tandem. Scholars have begun this process, and Elman has written on the numerous ritual acts and theological concepts shared by the Bavli and Zoroastrian texts. Herman has discovered strong links between Iranian and Armenian literature and Bavli Agadot. As comparative literature allows us to compare structure and forms, I have previously discussed the significance of extended passages in the Zend, which bear the characteristic of proto-sugyot. In addition, scholars working on Irano-Talmudica have started to profitably mine Manichaean literature, and have also encouraged researchers to look beyond Iranian writings to Syriac, Mandaic, and indigenous Babylonian texts as well. The return of Talmudists to Iranian texts assures us that the next number of years, no decades, will completely change the way scholars perceive the Bavli, its sages, and the entire Babylonian Jewish community. Accordingly, questions of method and direction are exceedingly important at this early stage. We must look back at the work done in the first part of the 20th century, and especially the exciting research of the past few years, and highlight the specific areas that Iranian studies has illuminated. Also, which broader assumptions have been challenged and which have been confirmed. We must also contemplate the various research models available to Talmudists who wish to contextualize the Bavli, and consider their respective merits and shortcomings. Most significantly, we need to look ahead and speculate how we might best ensure a successful future for the burgeoning field of Iranian Talmudica and even the advancement of Middle Iranian and Talmudic studies as separate disciplines. In the 19th century, a number of scholars began the task of assessing the rabbinic material in light of Persian language, culture, and religion. Most prominent among these was Alexander Kohut, who in his Aruch Completium claimed to have uncovered numerous words of Persian origin that made their way into the Babylonian Talmud. To be sure, his earnestness led him to mistakenly attribute many Aramaic words to Iranian languages, and these were criticized in reviews of the work. Although Geiger's addendum to Kohut's Aruch was no less groundbreaking, it was certainly more cautious. Kohut, Levi, Krauss, Geiger, and other scholars also turned to comparative religion, focusing, among other issues, on the providence of the Bavli's demonology and eschatology, and published not a few studies still useful to modern Talmudists today. However, their greatest contribution must certainly be appreciated in the realm of language. The important Talmudic dictionaries of this period took the search for Persian loanwords as seriously as the parallel hunt for Greek and Latin and Palestinian rabbinic works. Incredibly, the standard monograph on the topic in use today was published back in 1935. Yet, outside of the groundbreaking articles published by Shaul Shaked in the final decades of the past century, and a few by scholars like Ezra Spicehandler, there is very little to speak of from the late 1930s on. This means that notwithstanding the recent publication of Michael Sokolov's Dictionary of Babylonian Jewish Aramaic, which includes many of Shaked's findings, the most basic contribution of Iranian studies to Talmud, the one of language, has not been fully realized. It is apparent that nowhere near all of the Iranian loanwords in the Talmud, not to mention Indo-European grammatical and syntactical forms, have been properly identified. Consequently, Talmudists familiar with Iranian languages continue to identify more words of Persian origin in the Bavli. What is becoming increasingly clear is the significance of Middle Iranian languages for understanding the Bavli beyond simply the correct interpretation of occasional Persian loanwords. Recognition of the complex interplay between culture and language is necessary when properly assessing the impact of Iranian religions, law, and culture and language on the Talmud and its world. Accordingly, scholars have wondered why there are numerous Greek loanwords in Palestinian rabbinic works, and by all accounts, far less Persian words in the Bavli. Some point to these statistics as evidence of a general lack of Babylonian rabbinic acculturation, and question the ability of the rabbis to have conducted even the most basic conversation with their Persian compatriots. In order to properly address this question, we cannot simply contrast percentages of foreign terms in Palestinian and Babylonian rabbinic works. Instead, we need to assess the data in its own context. First, scholars must thoroughly examine Christian Syriac and other minority literature of Babylonia to test whether the state of affairs in rabbinic documents is consistent with the rest of the Aramaic-speaking population or whether it is anomalous. More to the point, we must be careful when comparing the valence of Aramaic in lands under Iranian domination with its position in places like Palestine, where citizens were subject to Roman rule and were exposed to Hellenistic culture. Accordingly, in the course of explaining the widespread phenomenon of Aramaic heterograms in Pahlavi, Shaul Shaked has emphasized the antiquity and significance of Imperial Aramaic in the entire ancient Near East. As an official language during Achaemenid times, Aramaic was used in written communication between Persian-speaking authorities, and scribes found themselves involved in the cumbersome task of translating Iranian languages into Aramaic when composing a letter, and translating from Aramaic back into Iranian when reading one. Despite the fact that in Sasanian times Persian was the bureaucratic language in Mesopotamia, Aramaic-speaking Mandeans, Christians, pagans, and Jews spoke a language that not only had deep roots in Babylonia, but also had some resonance with their Persian neighbors. Furthermore, Elman has pointed out that the loanwords which do show up in Babylonian Jewish Aramaic actually indicate a fairly high level of familiarity with Middle Persian. Apart from the expected items of food and dress, notably a few distinctly Jewish nouns like korban tamid or daily sacrifice are substituted occasionally by Middle Persian terms, here padros. Prepositions such as now and above are again occasionally expressed by Persian abar and zi. Even more significantly, Elman has recently pointed out that ayabne, or not, a Middle Persian syntactic form frequently employed in the Madiani Hazardadistan at the conclusion of interrogative clauses, is directly parallel to Bavli's distinct ilah, ola, or not. In addition, Elman's work on the calques of Middle Persian phrases into Babylonian Jewish Aramaic, and Herman's recent proposal that Zoroastrian Persian mahwag appears in its correct technical use in a Talmudic discussion about Zoroastrian eating rituals, points to the linguistic as well as cultural comfort and understanding that Jews enjoyed with their Persian neighbors. Finally, Elman has collected the evidence of Talmudic narratives to show that the most prominent Babylonian Aramaic spoke and understood Pahlavi, even if it seems that they were unable to decipher its notoriously difficult script. Thus, despite the primary language of the rabbis, which like the rest of the Mesopotamian population was Eastern Aramaic, the overwhelming evidence actually indicates the ease with which they could have entered into dialogue with Persians. Showing the possibilities of that interaction is the task of historians, who have devoted themselves most intensely since the late 1960s to try to understand the place of the Babylonian Jews in the Sasanian Empire. Before this period, most of the work consisted of compiling Talmudic narratives that depicted rabbis in contact with Sasanian rulers and Zoroastrian priests. With the work of Moshe Ber and Jacob Neusner, this method was replaced with a more critical one, which allowed historians to assign varying levels of reliability to the sources and encouraged them to devise new methods of extracting history from the texts. In addition, M.D. Hare produced a few monographs on various aspects of the Babylonian Jewish community. Isaiah Gaffney's The Jews of Babylonia in a Talmudic Era, published in 1990, differs from earlier works in that it examines the Jewish community from a broader cultural perspective and critically weighs the reliability of the rabbinic and Gaonic sources through textual criticism and, most importantly, against Iranian documents. Richard Kalman's recent studies also emphasize the need to carefully work through Talmudic material before drawing any conclusions about important historical phenomenon, like the time, scope, and severity of religious persecutions. In addition, 3 Hebrew University dissertations, that of Adil Schremer, Eli Achtut, and Jeffrey Herman, employ Iranian material in their respective studies of Jewish marriage, the status of women, and the institution of the Reish Galuta. As we mentioned above, of these 3, Herman's work on the Exilarch is based on the most careful, critical use of primary Pahlavi and Syriac texts. Herman's most striking contribution seems to be a methodological one. Besides also emphasizing the need for critical textual work of all primary materials before employing them in historical reconstruction, his method of reconstructing the role of the Reish Galuta consists of placing it directly within the immediate Sasanian Mesopotamian context. To this end, Herman charts the geographical regions of Sasanian Mesopotamia by recourse to numismatics, epigraphy, and other archaeological evidence, and a Pahlavi work of royal geography, in order to locate the possible extent of the Reish Galuta's authority. He also looks at how other religious community leaders, like Zoroastrian priests and especially Christian clerics, position themselves in the royal capital as a model for understanding how and why the Exilarch, Reish Galuta, placed himself in proximity to the seat of government. The comparison with the Christian church bears other fruits as well. Herman shows how the relationship between the so-called Eastern and Western church can shed significant light on the relationship between the 2 primary rabbinic centers in Babylonian Palestine. In other words, Herman achieves his reconstruction of the Exilarch in his world not by simply understanding the rabbis, Jews, and Exilarch as a group subject to Sasanian laws and Zoroastrian, pagan, and Christian influence, but by seeing them as equal participants in cosmopolitan Sasanian Mesopotamian society. This understanding, which Gaffney seems to have considered, but only reached its clearest articulation in the research of Herman, and as we will show below, especially that of Elman, can be appreciated through comparison with the development of the academic study of the Yerushalmi. Peter Schaefer has briefly described this evolution in his introduction to the first volume of the Talmud Yerushalmi in its Greco-Roman Context series. Academic research of the Yerushalmi and Palestinian Midrash began over 100 years ago with a primarily linguistic bent. Scholars were interested in listing Greek and Latin loanwords that made their way into Rabbinic Hebrew and Jewish Galilean Aramaic, partly in an effort to show the interaction between the rabbis and Hellenized members of the population. However, even scholars like Krauss claim that at least in the realm of realia, the Jews continue with their Oriental traditions quite apart from their Hellenistic environment. With the advancement of archaeology and more critical textual study, this view was disproved, and scholars began to find more and more signs of Greco-Roman influence in all sectors of rabbinic life. However, the research continued to take place along the lines of searching for specific signs of influence, literary borrowings, and the like. In time, as scholars of Jewish studies and classics developed the broader notion of Hellenism, the Yerushalmi became to be understood as a document that represents the participation of the rabbis in the greater Greco-Roman conversation, not as influencers, nor as an influence group, but as active members of a diverse and wide-ranging Hellenistic community. Much of Elman's research has been dedicated to an articulation of a similar position regarding the Bavli. Although he has already identified numerous elements of Zoroastrian, Manichaean, and other sustaining Mesopotamian influence, and has succeeded in shedding light on many an obscure Talmudic phrase, passage, or institution, this has all been part of a project to show how the rabbis and other members of Sasanian society shared a common universe of discourse. Thus, the fact that the fourth generation Amora, Rava, borrows a Zoroastrian phrase attributed to the high priest Adurbadi Marispandan regarding the central role of fate, Persian Bacht, or Hebrew Mazal, in the universe, does not simply shed light on a distinctly Babylonian rabbinic reverence for the power of astrology, or the ability of Rava to access such information, but shows how both Rava and the author of this Zoroastrian phrase were taking part in a cross-cultural conversation about fate and theodicy. Similarly, Elman's claim that Rava's defense of the oral nature of rabbinic literature was in part a response to a Manichaean critique and preference for the written word does not only tell us of the receptivity of Machozen Jewry to Manichaean ideas, but again locates the validity of orality as a mode of transition as a broader, hot-button issue in Sasanian Mesopotamia. In addition, regarding corpse and menstrual impurity and legal principles like retrospectivity and doubts, the common universe of discourse shared by Jews and Zoroastrians is especially conspicuous. Elman has begun to chart the various ways this discourse was incorporated by different segments of the Babylonian Jewish community. The breakdown roughly takes place along the lines of accommodators and resistors, but with many shades of gray in between. So Rava, the leading sage of the capital suburb Machoza, can be unambiguously classified as an accommodator. On the other hand, Rav Yosef, the Pumbedian, although ostensibly a resistor, is not afraid to quite literally take part in the greater Iranian conversation in the form of interfaith debate, since he is one of them. Thus, our understanding of the discourse taking place between rabbis and other groups in Babylonia helps us get a sense of the internal makeup of the Jewish community as well. Those of you who have been reading the recent scholarly output of Elman and Herman may be familiar with some of these exciting findings and can see how many of them may be incorporated into the above-described framework. I would like to briefly present a recent discovery by dressing it in similar garb as an example of rabbinic and Zoroastrian literature occupying a place in a broader Iranian outlook. In the following illustration, recourse to Iranian texts will help us not only to understand an incomprehensible Talmudic concept by attributing it to foreign influence, it also allows us to see Iranian and Talmudic literature as complementary expressions of the same world. Like much of the Bavli, Tractate Nida is a relatively conservative work. It takes its cues from the Mishnah's content and structure and incorporates halachic midrash, Tosefta, and a large amount of Palestinian Aramaic material in its discussions of the rabbinic menstrual laws. However, it also contains a few concepts that are not only innovative, they appear to be completely sui generis. Among the preoccupations of the rabbinic menstrual laws is defining which blood is menstrual, and therefore conveys the legal category of nidah, and which can be attributed to other causes, and that which can be attributed to other causes, and allows a woman to continue her everyday life as usual. Tannaitic sources list a number of substances that can be confused with menstrual blood, including lice blood, various dyes, and blood from an injury. However, no Palestinian sources hint at a notion of what's called dam chimud, or blood of desire, as occupying a similar status to the Mishnah's other false positives. Nevertheless, two Bavli narratives depict the category of blood of desire as a self-explanatory substance which is apparently pure. On the other hand, the anonymous layer of the Talmud later in the tractate assumes that the sexual desire which a girl experiences upon marriage proposal requires her to wait 7 days before consummation, since she must have begun menstruating. Traditional commentators have attempted to come to terms with the origin of this rule, and also the contradiction between the first source, which portrays blood of desire as pure, and the latter one as impure. In addition, modern scholars have wondered about where such an idea could have come from in the first place, and propose that it is based on an androcentric reading of female physiology, or betrays a relationship to Hippocratic medicine. Actually, a concept of blood of desire is stated explicitly in the 15th chapter of the Bundeshition, a Zoroastrian work of cosmology and other ancient Iranian knowledge. There it states, Udashtani zen, Udashtani gospandan, Wardagi, Che gospandan kawadag bawed, chon mizind. And the menstruation of women and the menstruation of cattle are expressions of heat, since cattle, when they are in heat, expel blood. This sentence glosses a prior passage which recommends that a couple engage in sex within the first 10 days of menstruation if they desire a child. Since menstruation is seen as an expression of female heat, it indicates the female's readiness to conceive, and it must be realized as soon as legally possible in Zoroastrian law. Thus, the expulsion of menstrual blood is linked to desire, and at least recalls the latter Talmudic source which treats dam chimud as impure, since it is regular menstruation which is emitted upon what's deemed as regular desire. On the other hand, a passage later in the same chapter depicts the seed which a female supposedly emits during intercourse as blood. This blood is certainly not menstrual. Otherwise, Zoroastrian law would require women to observe the requisite menstrual seclusion every time she engages in sex. Instead, we have here a different kind of blood of desire, which appears to be emitted upon orgasm, but does not convey menstrual impurity. This seems to be the substance referred to in the two Bavli narratives, which does not convey a status of nida. It is important to note that this entire chapter, chapter 15 in the Bundeshition, seems to be based on young Avestan material, as an outline of its contents appears in almost the exact same order in a Denkard Book 8 description of one of the lost nesks of the Avesta. In other words, an ancient Iranian idea probably sits behind the puzzling Talmudic concept of dam chimud, and provides a link between female desire and menstrual blood, or alternatively, female seed which is described as blood. According to this Iranian idea, not all vaginal blood conveys menstrual impurity, but all vaginal blood implies desire or is associated with conception. Further examination of this passage in the Bundeshition, which also describes Zoroastrian embryology and other aspects of the nature of intercourse, allows us to appreciate a particularly Iranian view regarding the connection between blood, female desire, and embryonic conception. In a forthcoming study, Rubin Kipperwasser, with the help of Dan Shapira, will show how the old rabbinic notion of three partners, namely a child's father, mother, and God, was molded in the Bavli by an Indo-Iranian notion, also explicated in the 15th chapter of the Bundeshition, that female blood contributes to the formation of the fetus. This is opposed to Greco-Roman and Palestinian rabbinic notions of female blood acting merely as a protective covering for the semen, or alternatively, an idea that the dynamic male seed can work as a catalyst in the formless female blood. In other words, it is not simply that the Babylonian rabbis directly borrowed an idea of blood of desire from Iranian science. They developed their own traditions, such as the three partners and blood of desire for menstrual laws, by way of an entire matrix of Indo-Iranian conceptions of female seed, menstrual and embryological blood, and desire. It seems to me that interpreting the data this way is an inherently expansive method, which allows Talmudists to derive the greatest benefit from Iranian studies. However, I also believe that this model has important implications for the role of Talmudists in Iranian studies. In many ways, the hierarchical order of Irano-Talmudica mirrors the relationship that once existed between the minority Babylonian rabbinic community and their Persian neighbors. Ostensibly, as subjects of the Sasanian kingdom, the rabbis would have needed to pay far more attention to the Persians than vice versa. Aside from earlier important contributions of Shaul Shaked and Maria Metzuch, Elman has almost single-handedly engaged Iranists in conversations about the nature of the Bavli. By forming partnerships with Iranists, especially Dr. Shervo of Harvard, he has gotten the field off the ground. But again, this has been primarily monodirectional. However, as Elman himself has noted, the potential contribution of the Bavli to Iranian studies proper is enormous. Since the vast majority of Pahlavi literature was not written down until after the fall of the Sasanian Empire, and even the important Sasanian law book, Madiani Hazardalistan, was not compiled until the 7th century, the Bavli often serves as our earliest source for Sasanian law, Persian culture, and even Zoroastrian religion. In addition, if we perceive the position of the rabbis in the ways outlined above as more or less equal partners in a larger Iranian enterprise, the Bavli's record of Talmudic culture and law can partially inform our understanding of Sasanian Mesopotamian society as a whole. Finally, a not insignificant advantage that Talmudists can contribute to Iranian studies relates to the very personal nature of scholarly interests. Throughout the development of Persian studies, Iranists have not hid their interest in what they deem to be the sexier parts of Zoroastrian lore, nor their disdain for dry, technical works of law and ritual. Thus, the late Mary Boyce contrasts the unattractive casuistry of the legal compendium, Shayist Nishayist, to the much more important and fundamental work, in her words, the Bundahishn. For a halakhically minded Talmudist, like me, it is precisely this unattractive casuistry which is the most fascinating, and which contains the greatest promise for engaging Iranian and Talmudic texts in tandem. Yet, it is not simply that Talmudists trained in Iranian studies will focus on those texts that Iranists choose not to be bothered with. By virtue of their training in decoding technical, complicated sugyot, Talmudists are uniquely equipped to tackle similar Zoroastrian texts, which again are part of the common universe of discourse. Accordingly, Elman, with the help of Dr. Shervo, and I, with the aid of Shaul Shaked and Shervo, are currently engaged in producing critical editions and studies of some of the technical purities chapters of the Pahlavi Videvdan. It is unnecessary to repeat the distressing news that the future of the humanities in universities around the world, and especially in Israel, is in dire straits. As many know, this is especially the case with departments such as those of Old and Middle Iranian studies that are being downsized or alternatively absorbed beyond recognition. This is not only a loss for those of us who would like to continue to be enriched by and preserve pre-Islamic Iranian culture, but as I have tried to express, it does not bode well for the future of Talmud as well. Students of the Bavli are increasingly excited by the great potential held by Irano-Talmudic studies. And if in the foreseeable future they are unable to even learn Middle Iranian languages, then this exciting epoch will end before achieving its realization. I suspect that those directly involved in achieving a solution to this problem will be required to engage in, for example, non-traditional methods of fundraising, and similarly, they will be forced to develop new kinds of departmental alliances. On the other hand, the marriage between Talmud and Iranian studies has been a match that has been long in coming. A true collaboration between these fields will not only force scholars to completely reconsider their understanding of the Bavli and other Sasanian texts, it will help ensure a more viable future for Iranian and Talmudic studies as distinct and cooperative disciplines in the coming years. Thank you.
Well, we have been treated by Shai Secunda not only to a survey of the field, but also to some examples of the current, what one may call a revolution in approach from the side of Jewish studies towards Iranian studies, which one hopes will bear impressive fruit, as it has already done. And we have heard about several examples in the field of purity laws that Shai himself is working on. Again, if there are any questions or remarks to be made, please. done.
Not correct. I'm not a co-author of the philosophy study
Oh,
of three partners.
okay.
We did Aviv, Iranian Contacts, and we suggested one of them about Korea and the three like us with this conference, but in the three partners.
You're not a co-author. Okay. Thank you for the correction.
Yes, please.
Ignorant question. What remains original? You speak of so much influence from the outside. Can you elucidate then maybe the original in the Talmud? Is it a mixture of this external and Torah, or?
It seems like it's a combination of the old and the new, like most ancient documents, and especially compilations. I mean, as I said regarding, for example, most of the Bavli is, most of its texts are, in Tractate Nida, most of the texts are Palestinian from Eretz Israel, and the point of departure is from the Mishnah. So they already have, besides the Bible and the other, Semitic, or other parts of our Semitic heritage, we have an entire corpora of Jewish works before they even begin to encounter this Indo-European culture, which they find themselves in contact with. So I wouldn't say that there's, by any means, that I may be enthusiastic, but I don't think that there's nothing left of a core of Jewish ideas in the Bavli. Yeah.
A few years ago, I was doing some research on the Zoroastrian laws of death and dying, and I was surprised to see the similarities between the laws of Shiva and death and burial in Judaism. Has any research been done on that? I mean, to me, that's such an obvious thing that one took from the other.
I mean, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but I know that there has been some research on it. Actually, I have a colleague who's speaking, I don't know if he'll still be in Israel, next week in the Hebrew University on that very topic. There has been research done in it, but what we have to keep in mind, especially with things like purity laws and specifically menstrual laws or corpse impurity laws, is that both Judaism and Zoroastrians have a very, very old system of law, which in the case of the Zoroastrians can date back as early as 1200 BCE in parts of the Vesta, and we as well have Vayikra and our ancient Torah. What's interesting to see is with our own conceptions, when we do meet, it's debatable when that exactly happens, if it's in ancient Judaism, if it doesn't happen until Talmudic times, what happens in terms of the interaction. But I definitely think there's what to talk about there. I can refer you afterwards to research.
This three-way cooperation go beyond this particular topic? Is that expected?
I hope so. It's the beginning. I'm only writing my dissertation, so it will.
Much success about time that such project was off the ground, and I thank Professor Shaked. I know his contribution is invaluable. I hope you produce more students who can work in those fields.
Well, I think the major importance of the present trend is, as Shai has already pointed out, is in focusing not so much on influences of one side on the other, but on the interaction, on the, a word that used to be fashionable some years ago, symbiosis of Jews and Iranians in the Sasanian period. And so it's not really important, and it's impossible in many cases to tell whether the one side influenced the other, but they really shared a common culture, a common background, and I think that this is also noticeable in the field of loanwords. Loanwords seem to be one-sided. I mean, one language borrows from the other. But in fact, the Jews used Aramaic, which was a lingua franca of Babylonia and of the rest of the Iranian empires in the plural. And they really didn't borrow from Persians as such. They used a common heritage, which was expressed by the use of Aramaic. And in this sense, this also integrates into the same point of view. Any other? Yes, please.
The specific question of purity laws, it is so dominant in what you're asking religion, as well as later you see in various aspects of Jewish law. I want to take it maybe a little further to Iran itself, and the way that it was, these purity laws projected into the religious minorities. And this is a very tough question. To what extent the ancient Iranian Zoroastrian influences really shaped the early Islam and the Shia interpretation of non-Muslims, which has direct relevance to the position of the Jews late particularly from the 15th, 16th century. Professor Goldseer has touched on that. But it is, again, I think, a major question. To what extent really this local, concept and ideas shape those later attitudes, religious attitudes, and legal attitudes?
I don't know if I'm fully equipped to answer that question because I've studied a bit about Islamic menstrual laws, very specified. But in terms of the other being impure, I don't feel equipped to properly respond. So.
Well, again, this is an underexplored field. I mean, what of Sasanian culture continues in Iran, in Islamic Iran, and to what extent Shiism absorbed Iranian Sasanian elements, Sasanian notions, and so on. One sees certain elements in this. I think one can speak about elements like the taqiyya, kitman, as existing so continuing a trend of the Sasanian period in the Shia. And I'm sure that there are other promising avenues of research in this field. It's very difficult at this stage to say anything really definite about these things. And I think the two papers that we heard this morning demonstrate the potential for such fertile collaboration between Iranianists and Talmudists for understanding the Sasanian period. It's not only the Sasanian sources, which are really very meager, that can shed light on Jewish history in Iran. It's also the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you.